February 1965. Harlem winter air. Sharp enough to sting the lungs. The kind of cold that makes every footstep sound louder than it should. Somewhere between the streetlights and the shadows, a message moved the way Harlem messages always moved. Quietly, urgently, as if the city itself didn't want to be caught repeating it. Malcolm X was running out of time. And then came the offer that sounded impossible on paper and perfectly logical on the street. Protection from Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man whose name could empty a room faster than a siren. But the real shock wasn't the offer. The shock was the refusal. What kind of leader turns down armed help when threats are no longer rumors? And what kind of neighborhood learns, again and again, that safety isn't only about guns, but about who gets seen standing beside you? To understand that decision, the story has to rewind. Past a swinging light bulb, past 12 barrels, past a $50,000 bribe, and into the unwritten law that made Harlem feel untouchable. Harlem didn't invent crime, it was pushed into inventing survival. In the 1930s, the Great Depression didn't just drain paychecks. It drained options. Jobs disappeared first from the margins, and black neighborhoods felt the squeeze of discrimination, overcrowding, and a system that offered rules without protection. In that pressure, the numbers racket became more than a gamble. It was a shadow bank for people locked out of real banks. A weekly ritual of hope for families who couldn't afford optimism any other way. Small bets moved through barbershops, kitchens, beauty salons, storefronts, paper slips and whispered digits circulating like a heartbeat in a place that the official economy treated like a blind spot. And at the center of that ecosystem stood Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen, a woman who understood that control wasn't only about money, it was about dignity. Her empire wasn't built on flashy violence. It was built on networks, discipline, and the community's belief that Harlem's money should stay Harlem's. But every profitable system attracts predators. When outside crews lost easy income streams and looked for the next river of cash, Harlem became a target, because it was dense, desperate, and rich in unprotected profit. Dutch Schultz saw Harlem the way a buyer sees a bargain. Something to acquire through fear. He didn't need Harlem's love, only Harlem's compliance, and the quickest way to purchase compliance is to make refusal feel fatal. That's where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson becomes more than muscle. He becomes a boundary. He wasn't simply guarding money. He was guarding the idea that Harlem could refuse occupation. The conflict wasn't just between men, it was between two definitions of ownership. The community's informal economy versus an outsider's armed takeover. Then time moved and the underworld evolved. By the 1940s and 1950s, crime learned to speak like business. Power wore tailored suits and negotiated in percentages, because percentages are cleaner than gunfire and easier to sustain. Italian mafia figures understood that Harlem's numbers weren't street money. They were infrastructure, a cash machine powered by thousands of small hopes. So the question shifted from, who can scare Harlem? To, who can tax Harlem without lighting a war? Meanwhile, Harlem itself changed. Post-war pressures, tighter policing, rising political heat, and a community learning to distrust anyone who promised salvation with a hand already in their pocket. Bumpy's own path mirrored that era. Arrests, prison time, long stretches away, and then a return to a neighborhood that felt both familiar and newly dangerous. And that's why the Malcolm X thread matters as more than a side story. In this period, a public voice could become a target as quickly as a criminal empire could. A leader could be surrounded by supporters and still be isolated by politics, optics, and fear, because in Harlem, protection wasn't only about guns. It was about what your protection says about you. Sometimes the first sound of a power shift isn't a gunshot. Sometimes it's a dry little click that tells everyone in the room, betrayal has arrived, and the math is about to change. Light bulb, past 12 barrels, past a $50,000 bribe, and into the unwritten law that made Harlem feel untouchable. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't move like a man chasing chaos. He moved like a man managing it. Harlem remembered small habits the way it remembers flags. The way he always chose a seat with his back protected. The way he folded a napkin with quiet precision before business began. The way his eyes listened to rooms before his mouth did. That was the first misunderstanding outsiders made about him. They thought he was only a threat. Harlem understood he was also a regulator. He could be violent when cornered, but his real talent was psychological, turning fear into discipline, turning discipline into rules, and turning rules into an economy that could function without collapsing into constant war. Even the objects tied to his legend weren't random. They were symbols engineered to travel faster than any bullet. An ace of spades that could become a message, a disabled revolver that could expose betrayal without a body, a straight razor that could mark a man instead of ending him, a photograph that could force a boss to negotiate instead of invade. What kind of criminal builds power by making sure stories outlive the moment? And what kind of neighborhood accepts that power because it feels safer than the alternative? Across from him stood Dutch Schultz, a man who treated Harlem like a business opportunity with a trigger. Schultz didn't need to understand Harlem's pride. He only needed Harlem's fear. That's why the Cotton Club basement legend matters. 12 gunmen in a damp concrete box weren't just there to kill a man. They were there to send an invoice. Pay up or disappear. But Bumpy's entire identity was built around refusing invoices written by outsiders. Harlem Doesn't Sell wasn't poetry. It was policy. Then there was Lucky Luciano, a different predator with a cleaner mind. Luciano represented the modern underworld, less interested in street drama, more interested in systems. He didn't ask for Harlem's soul. He asked for a percentage. In his world, control looked like a handshake and a ledger, because a ledger lasts longer than a gunfight. That's why their rumored Stork Club negotiation becomes a turning point in this mythology. Not because it proves Bumpy could intimidate bosses, but because it suggests he could bend their logic, offer profit without occupation, business without soldiers on Harlem's corners. The most dangerous man in the room isn't always the man with the gun. Sometimes it's the man who can make the gun unnecessary. But the deepest threats to Bumpy weren't always outsiders. They were the people closest to him, the ones who knew his routines, his blind spots, his soft spots. Big Sam Foster was built like a promise. Tall, heavy, loyal-looking, the kind of bodyguard people trust because he feels like gravity behind your shoulder. Yet Harlem's hardest truth is that loyalty is often tested by desperation, not greed. A sick child, a crushing bill, a suitcase of money. Suddenly betrayal doesn't sound like evil, it sounds like survival. That's why the Lenox Lounge moment is so chilling in this story. A packed club, 300 witnesses, jazz still floating in the air, and a revolver raised behind the man who believed he could read every room. The offer was $50,000, the kind of number that turns fear into persuasion. When the trigger clicked instead of firing, it didn't just expose Sam. It exposed an entire hidden market where men are purchased the way products are purchased. And when Bumpy answered, "I've been counting on you," it hit like a courtroom verdict spoken softly, because it suggested he had anticipated the betrayal and planned a punishment that would live longer than a gunshot. Public shame, followed by exile. In Harlem, dying can be quick. Being cast out can last a lifetime. Then there was Marcus "Smooth" Henderson, the protege, the young man trusted to keep things running when Bumpy was gone. Time is supposed to soften betrayals. In this mythology, time sharpens them. 11 years is long enough for a deputy to forget he was ever a deputy. Long enough to start calling a borrowed kingdom an inheritance. Smooth's betrayal, real or exaggerated by legend, carries a particular sting because it's not just about money, it's about identity. If Bumpy built Harlem's rules, what does it mean when the next generation sells those rules for comfort? The razor scene at Small's Paradise becomes the perfect symbolic punishment. Not death, but a permanent mark that turns a face into a warning label. Finally, Sal Bonanno represented the arrogance of bloodline. Walking into a neighborhood like Harlem was a stage where he could perform dominance. The Wells restaurant standoff, with its 6 bodyguards and 40 diners, becomes the final lesson of the character map. Bumpy's strongest weapon was never the razor or the gun. It was the room, the community that had quietly chosen him as the lesser evil, the local shield, the man who paid hospital bills and settled disputes before they became funerals. And that's where the Malcolm X thread starts to glow in the background. Because Malcolm's power was public, moral, symbolic power that could be strengthened or damaged by association. If Bumpy offered protection, it wasn't just protection. It was a message. The question wasn't only, would it keep Malcolm alive? The question was, what would it make Malcolm become in the eyes of the world? Every legend about Bumpy Johnson is really a legend about architecture, about how a man can turn a room into a verdict. Harlem's old-timers described these moments like crime scene diagrams drawn from memory. Angles, exits, light sources, who sat where, who stood behind whom, who controlled the door. The first room was the simplest and the most brutal. The Cotton Club basement on February 14, 1933, for 32 a.m. A concrete box breathing damp winter air, one narrow staircase as the only throat of escape, wooden crates stacked like accidental barricades, and one naked light bulb swinging overhead like a metronome counting down the courage of everyone inside. 12 gunmen formed a loose ring, coats dripping from the cold outside, fingers tightening on hidden steel. The props weren't decorative. They were destiny. Glass above, darkness below, and the knowledge that panic is the fastest poison in a confined space. That's why the Ace of Spades matters in this story. Not as a gangster flourish, but as a portable headline. A card is small enough to vanish into a pocket, strange enough to be repeated accurately, and symbolic enough to travel as a warning. If Harlem didn't have newspapers writing its rules, Harlem had images. An ace of spades with a smear of meaning, and a sentence that sounded like law. Harlem doesn't sell. Then the story steps into a different kind of trap, Manhattan velvet, not Harlem concrete. The Stork Club VIP room in 1946 was designed to make criminals look respectable. Polished tables, expensive air, a silence that felt purchased. In that room, the weapon wasn't a gun. It was exposure. Bumpy didn't need to shout. He needed leverage that could survive outside the room, something that could turn a private conversation into a public disaster if necessary. That's where the photograph enters the myth. A single image slid across a table like a blade laid flat. Not cutting flesh, cutting alliances. In a world where bosses survive on fear, a photograph threatens something worse than death. Loss of control over the narrative. In that room, percentages were bullets and reputations were armor. And a calm face mattered more than a loud one. 2 years later, in 1948, the stage became ordinary again. Wells Restaurant, where the air smelled like ribs, pepper, collard greens, warm grease, and tired workdays. About 40 diners filled the space, ordinary people, not soldiers, but that was the point. In a restaurant, the crowd is the wall. The wall is the warning. A man like Sal Bonanno didn't just arrive with 6 bodyguards. He arrived with arrogance, expecting the room to surrender. That's why the straight razor belongs in this scene even before it's touched, because a razor on a table reads like a signature. It says, "This isn't a brawl, it's a statement." It says, "The punishment will be remembered." And it's why Bumpy's gaze mattered more than his hands, because he looked around first, silently counting the people whose lives he'd touched, as if to remind an outsider that in Harlem, a room full of diners can become an army without ever standing up. A decade later, on September 12, 1958, the trap moved into music. Lenox Lounge on a packed Friday night, 300 witnesses, smoke hanging in layers, trumpet notes climbing the walls and dropping back into laughter. Here, the weapon wasn't darkness or a photograph or a razor. It was humiliation engineered with precision. Bumpy sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, his glass untouched, his napkin folded as if violence had to wait for manners. Big Sam Foster stood behind him like gravity, huge, steady, familiar. And that's what made the setup cruel. The betrayal would come from the place everyone expects protection. The revolver's click only works as mythology if the room is full, because the message needs witnesses. A gun that doesn't fire is usually a failure. In this story, it's a sermon. Finally, the brightest stage in the sequence arrives in June 1963. Small's Paradise, Table 7, lights hot enough to make sweat look like truth. Marcus Smooth Henderson sits like a man who believes time has rewritten ownership. Bumpy enters like an audit, not a storm. 3 loyal men close enough to end arguments quickly, but kept invisible because the real punishment is meant to be seen, not fought. The razor returns here not as a threat, but as an instrument enough to mark, not enough to kill, because death ends rumors and scars create them. And behind all 5 rooms, the Malcolm X thread quietly tightens the theme. Protection isn't just about surviving the night. It's about what the night turns you into afterward. When a leader's power is public, every bodyguard is also a symbol, every alliance a headline, every help a story that can either protect or poison. The question isn't only whether a man can be saved. The question is whether he can be saved without being owned. February 14, 1933. 4:32 a.m. The basement under the Cotton Club didn't feel like a place where history would be made. It felt like a place where history would be erased. Concrete walls held damp winter air like a locked fist, and one naked light bulb swung overhead with the slow rhythm of inevitability. 12 gunmen, Dutch Schultz's best, stood in a loose circle, coats dripping, breath visible in the cold, fingers tightening on metal that never needed an introduction. In Harlem's telling, one of them laughed softly, a hitter named Tommy with a nickname that sounded like a job title, the executioner. The laugh wasn't joy, it was certainty. The kind of certainty men get when they believe the math has already been solved. One man in the center didn't plead. Bumpy Johnson, 27, watched shadows more than faces. He listened to the tiny sounds that reveal fear. Shoes shifting, a safety clicking, a swallow that lands too loud in silence. And then he looked at the bulb like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. "That's it?" he asked, low and almost bored. 12 of you. It wasn't a taunt for the gunmen. It was a question aimed at Harlem itself, a challenge to the idea that fear could be purchased wholesale. For half a second, surprise loosened the circle. In that half second, Bumpy reached up and smashed the only light. Glass burst. Darkness dropped like a curtain. And in the black, panic did what bullets couldn't. It broke coordination. A gun barrel knocked another. A shoulder slammed into crates. Someone fired too early, the sound ricocheting off walls that gave nothing back. Men tried to see and instead found only each other's breathing, each other's elbows, each other's doubt. Bumpy moved with memory instead of sight, using angles, the choke point of the staircase, the way fear makes grown men freeze and reach for whoever stands closest. What does a man do when he can't trust his eyes, and can't trust the man beside him? Minutes later, Harlem's story says 11 lay groaning or unconscious and one, Marty Delaney, remembered only because he lived, crawled up the stairs toward alley headlights slicing down like a knife. His hands were slick, his breath loud enough to betray him in daylight. Bumpy pressed something into his palm. An ace of spades with a smear that wasn't just blood, it was meaning. "Take it back," Harlem says he told him. "Tell him Harlem doesn't sell." Above them, jazz kept playing for people who would never know they were dancing over a turning point. The legend did what legends do. It grew, traveled, not as a police report but as a warning wrapped in a simple image. 12 guns, one light bulb, one man still standing. The calendar flips forward, then backward because Harlem remembers by impact, not order. Stork Club, VIP room, a different kind of basement, one made of velvet and expensive silence. Manhattan's polished lie, where crime wore tuxedos and spoke like business. Lucky Luciano sat with men whose names sounded like gravity. Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and others who understood that the cleanest power is the power that doesn't need to raise its voice. They didn't stare at the door waiting for Bumpy. They expected him to enter like a petitioner. He didn't. He did the first thing that mattered. He sat in a seat that wasn't offered. No speech, no apology. Just posture. Harlem wouldn't beg for permission to exist. Luciano's offer came like a contract clause. 40%. A number meant to sound generous while still meaning ownership. The room waited for Bumpy to react emotionally, because emotion is how negotiations are won. He didn't argue. He opened a briefcase and slid a photograph onto the table. The kind of photograph that doesn't need narration because it threatens a man's control of the narrative itself. The air shifted. Not fear of a gun, fear of exposure. Fear of attention. Fear of investigations and betrayals that bloom when a boss looks weak. Luciano's smile tightened. He studied Bumpy's face for panic, for bluff, for desperation. Found none. That was the pivot. 10. Harlem repeats, Bumpy answered. Not as a counteroffer, more like a verdict. 10%. And no Italian soldiers in Harlem. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Business can happen, profit can flow, but Harlem will not be occupied. Luciano weighed the photograph against the percentage, weighed pride against survival, and because he was the kind of boss who knew the value of living to win tomorrow, he accepted. Hands shook. History shifted without a shot fired. The lesson landed quietly. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one that turns violence into a bad deal. Wells Restaurant. The smell of ribs and pepper, collard greens and warm grease. An ordinary place where ordinary people tried to eat after ordinary days. About 40 diners filled the room. Bumpy sat with his wife, not performing power, just protecting a private moment with the calm of a man who believes he owns his neighborhood's oxygen. Then Sal Bonanno walked in with 6 bodyguards and the arrogance of bloodline. He carried himself like the room was already his and everyone else was waiting for instructions. Harlem's telling, says Sal, let a racial slur hang in the air like a match held too close to gasoline. Forks stopped midair. Conversation died. The silence wasn't fear at first, it was disbelief. A man had insulted the whole room and expected the room to remain furniture. Bumpy didn't reach for a gun. He didn't stand quickly. He placed a straight razor on the table with a surgeon's gentleness, as if signing a document. Then he looked around. Not at Sal first, at the diners. A butcher who'd been helped. A mother whose son had been escorted home. A shop owner who'd been spared a beating because Bumpy's name was enough to stop hands from moving. Bumpy's eyes counted them the way a banker counts collateral. Then he looked back at Sal and delivered 6 words with the calm of a man reading tomorrow's weather. Your uncle will bury you tomorrow. It wasn't simply a threat. It was a statement about how fast reckless heirs get erased when they embarrass the wrong people. Sal's confidence drained as he realized the room wasn't neutral. It had already chosen. The apology came, not because Sal respected Bumpy, but because Sal understood something worse than a gun. A verdict delivered by a community that refuses to look away. Sal apologized to Bumpy's wife. He backed out with 6 guns that never rose. The lesson traveled again, faster than newspapers. Harlem can be approached with money, with negotiation, even with fear, but it cannot be humiliated without consequence. September 12, 1958. Lenox Lounge. 300 witnesses. Smoke hanging in layers. Trumpet notes climbing the walls and falling back into laughter. The second confrontation was louder in its silence than any gunfight could have been. Bumpy sat at his corner table with an untouched glass of Hennessy, his back to the wall, his napkin folded with careful precision, as if he were eating dinner in his own home. Big Sam Foster stood behind him like always, huge, loyal-looking, the kind of man you trust because he feels like gravity. But loyalty, Bumpy knew, can be bought when desperation is the salesman. Harlem accounts say the offer was $50,000. Clean cash and a clean instruction. Do it once, do it quickly, do it in public so the message echoes. Sam's hand rose. The revolver appeared. The band kept playing at first because musicians don't see danger until the crowd does. Sam aimed. Sam pulled the trigger. Click. The sound was small, dry, almost pathetic, and it sliced through the room with more force than a gunshot because it meant betrayal had been exposed without even earning its violence. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then Bumpy turned slowly, lifted the glass, took one sip like he was tasting time itself, and spoke the line Harlem would repeat for decades. I've been counting on you. Not yelling, not furious, almost tender, like a father catching a son in a lie. He reached into his jacket and placed a thick envelope on the table. Hospital paperwork. Bills stamped and settled. Mercy that didn't belong in a room like this. Sam's face collapsed, not because he was caught, but because he realized the deeper cruelty. Bumpy had known, and instead of killing him, Bumpy had chosen a punishment that would follow him longer than a bullet, being spared in front of everyone. Sam's knees weakened under the weight of public forgiveness. And then Bumpy made it official. Not with violence, with exile. Sam was escorted out alive, ordered to leave Harlem and carry the story to every man who thought a bribe could outsmart a neighborhood. The lesson landed hard. In Harlem, the worst outcome isn't dying. It's living without a place to return to. June 11, 1963. Small's Paradise. 3 days after Bumpy's release. The lights were bright enough to make sweat look like truth, and Table 7 glowed like a stage. Marcus Smooth Henderson sat with ribs on his plate and cognac catching the light like amber. He wore the confidence of a man who believes he inherited a kingdom. 11 years, the story goes, years when Bumpy was locked away and Smooth was left to keep the machine running. Somewhere between responsibility and opportunity, Smooth began calling a borrowed empire his by right. When Bumpy entered, he didn't storm. He arrived like an audit. He sat. He folded his napkin. Smooth smiled too quickly, the smile of a man trying to turn guilt into charm. Bumpy asked Smooth's bodyguards to step away. They hesitated, then obeyed because even in betrayal, respect can have muscle memory. Under the table, 3 loyal men held shotguns angled down, present but unseen because the point was not chaos. The point was clarity. Bumpy set a straight razor on the table, not pointed at anyone, just present like a signature. 11 years, he said, as if counting interest. Smooth tried to explain, to bargain, to dress ambition in the language of necessity. But what does explanation buy when trust has already been sold? The razor moved with restraint, enough to mark, not to kill. A thin line opened on Smooth's cheek, a red stroke that turned his face into a public statement. The room froze. 250 people, maybe more, held their breath together because they understood the punishment wasn't pain. It was permanence. Smooth was allowed to leave alive. Carrying a scar Harlem could read like a headline. Betrayal doesn't always earn death, but it always earns a name. 5 confrontations. 5 messages. In darkness, coordination collapses. In velvet rooms, photographs outweigh bullets. In public, betrayal becomes shame. In bright clubs, scars outlive speeches. And in a modest restaurant, the community itself becomes a weapon. This was the law Bumpy built, or at least the law Harlem chose to believe in, because believing in it made the neighborhood feel protected. And that's why the Malcolm X question hits like a final twist. If Bumpy offered protection in 1964 to 1965, it wasn't just a bodyguard offer. It was an invitation into this law, into a world where safety is bought with reputation, and reputation can trap you as easily as it shields you. If power isn't only violence, then what is it? Money, leverage, or the quiet agreement of people who refuse to abandon you? The strange thing about Harlem power is that it doesn't spread like news. It spreads like weather. You don't hear it once. You feel it settle into how people walk, how they pause at corners, how they choose which stories to repeat and which names to avoid saying too loudly. After the Cotton Club basement, the legend didn't travel as a verified report. It traveled as a warning that sounded too clean to be ignored. 12 men went in confident. 1 man came out carrying an image that didn't belong to gunplay, an ace of spades, a symbol that could be shown without explanation. In Harlem's logic, that symbol mattered more than bruises because it did the job violence is supposed to do. It simplified the world. It told every small operator in every back room that there was a line outsiders couldn't cross without paying a price. And when a legend becomes a boundary, it reshapes behavior. Dutch Schultz's circle, whether they believed every detail or not, had to factor in one costly variable: unpredictability. The street doesn't demand perfect truth. It demands credible fear. So the story leapt from Harlem to the Bronx, from New York to nearby cities, not as what happened, but as what might happen to you. That's how Harlem guarded itself when official protection didn't exist. In that climate, a single surviving gunman, Marty Delaney, remembered because he crawled out, became part of the mechanism. A survivor is proof. A survivor is the person who can carry the warning without sounding like a salesman. And once that warning is believed, Harlem's underground economy becomes harder to bully because bullying becomes expensive. Then came the Stork Club thread, and its ripple was quieter but arguably more important. It taught outsiders that Harlem didn't have to be taken by force, because force produces headlines, investigations, and unpredictable backlash. Negotiation produces revenue without noise. If the deal was 10% and no soldiers, the exact number mattered less than the principle. Business could happen, but occupation could not. That kind of outcome changes the way predators think. They stop dreaming about conquest and start dreaming about taxation. The risk is that taxation can look peaceful while still draining a community, which is why Harlem's relationship with Bumpy was always complicated. He could keep outsiders from marching in, but he still lived on the money Harlem generated. That's the moral tension the neighborhood carried. The same man who protected the machine also benefited from it. The Wells restaurant story tightened that tension into something the community could accept emotionally. Because it was not a battle between crews. It was a moment of public dignity. When a reckless outsider insulted the room and left alive only after apologizing, the message wasn't "Bumpy is scary." The message was, Harlem is not a place where you get to humiliate people for entertainment. That matters to communities that are humiliated everywhere else. The Lenox Lounge incident, though, carried the most modern lesson. Betrayal isn't always a gunshot. Sometimes it's a click that exposes the whole marketplace behind the curtain. 300 witnesses hearing that dry sound meant Harlem didn't have to argue about what happened. The room itself became evidence. Big Sam's removal, alive, disgraced, exiled, turned mercy into punishment, and that kind of punishment is contagious. Men who might risk dying for money hesitate when the alternative is living without a neighborhood, without a name, without a place to return to. Exile is a slow death of identity, and Harlem understood identity is everything. Then Small's Paradise, June 1963, did what the best legends do. It compressed a decade of complexity into a single visible mark. A scar is a story you can't stop telling because it shows up before the man opens his mouth. Let Smooth walk away, and the scar does Bumpy's work for him for years. It warns the next ambitious deputy that running things, while the boss is gone, doesn't mean you own them. It also warns the community that Bumpy's law isn't random violence. It's calibrated consequence, designed to be remembered, designed to prevent bigger bloodshed later. And this is where the Malcolm X question becomes unavoidable. Because in 1964 to 1965, Harlem's climate was not just criminal, it was political, watched, tense, loaded with symbolism. Malcolm's influence was public and moral, and public power has a different vulnerability. Optics. In Bumpy's world, protection is a message. Bodyguards are not just muscle. They're a declaration of who you belong to. If Malcolm accepted Bumpy's protection, it could be interpreted as alignment, by enemies looking for propaganda, by supporters worried about purity, by authorities eager to label movements as criminal. Refusing protection, on the other hand, could mean standing alone in a city where threats aren't abstract. That's the tragedy the neighborhood felt in hindsight, that Harlem had built one kind of shield: street law, reputation, fear management, but a public leader needed a different shield, one that didn't compromise the very cause he stood for. Harlem's stories, after Malcolm's death, didn't just mourn a man. They mourned the gap between two types of power that couldn't easily merge. Bumpy's legend made Harlem feel untouchable, but it also revealed the cost of being untouchable. You become a symbol, and symbols attract forces bigger than any one room can control. The ripple effects, then, weren't only about who fled Harlem or who kept a percentage. They were about how a community learned, again, that survival is not just about winning confrontations. It's about choosing which alliances keep you alive without owning you. Harlem's stories about Bumpy Johnson don't survive because they're neat. They survive because they explain something the official world never wanted to admit. Power isn't only a gun in a hand. It's a room that agrees with you. A swinging light bulb in a basement became a weapon because fear collapses coordination. A photograph in a velvet VIP room outweighed bullets because reputation is more expensive than blood. A disabled revolver in front of 300 witnesses turned betrayal into shame because public truth is harder to erase than private violence. A razor didn't have to kill to punish because scars outlive speeches. And a modest restaurant full of ordinary diners became an army because community, when it's unified, can make even a bloodline back down. That was the law Harlem chose to believe in. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and Harlem doesn't sell. But the Malcolm X thread leaves a harder question hanging in the air. If Bumpy's protection was real, would it have saved Malcolm? Or would it have changed Malcolm into a symbol his enemies could exploit? And if refusing protection preserved Malcolm's image, did it also leave him alone at the worst possible time? In the end, Harlem's biggest lesson isn't that one man was untouchable. It's that every kind of power has a price: money, fear, leverage, reputation. And the most dangerous bill is the one you don't realize you've agreed to pay. Now, if you want more stories where the underworld and history collide, real dates, real stakes, and the unseen rules that shaped Harlem, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments. If you were in that Lenox lounge, hearing that dry click in front of 300 witnesses, would you have stayed seated, or would you have run?